Hey friends, so today we have the start of another new series. Today we are reading Brave New World by Aldous Leonard Huxley. Chapter 1. A squat grey building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, and, in a shield, the World State motto, community, identity, and stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north, cold for all the summer beyond the panes, for all the tropical heat of the room itself. A harsh, thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic goose flesh, but finding only the glass and nickel and bleaky shining porcelain of a laboratory. Windtreens responded to windtreens. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale corpse-coloured rubber. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopes did it borrow a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak in long recession down the work tables. "And this," said the director, opening the door, "is the fertilizing room." Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged as the director of hatcheries and conditioning entered the room. In the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded soliloquizing hum or whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young, pink and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook, in which, whenever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled. Straight from the horse's mouth. It was a rare privilege. The DHC for Central London always made a point of personally conducting his new students round the various departments. "Just to give you a general idea," he would explain to them. For of course some sort of general idea they must have, if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one, if they were to be good and happy members of society as possible. For particulars, as everyone knows, make virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers, but fret sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. "Tomorrow," he would add, smiling at them with a slightly menacing geniality, "you'll be settled down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege, straight from the horse's mouth into the notebook. The boys scribbled like mad. Tall and rather thin but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big, rather prominent teeth, just covered, when he was not talking, by his full, floridly curved lips. Old, young, 30, 50, or 55, it was hard to say. And anyhow the question didn't arise. In this year of stability, AF 632, it didn't occur to you to ask it. "I shall begin at the beginning," said the DHC, and the more zealous students recorded his intention in their notebooks. "Beginning at the beginning. These," he waved his hands, "are the incubators." And opening an insulated door, he showed them racks upon racks of numbered test tubes. "The week's supply of ova kept," he explained, "at blood heat, whereas the male gametes," and here he opened another door, "they have to be kept at 35 instead of 37, full blood heat sterilizers. Rams wrapped in thermogene beget no lambs." Still leaning against the incubators he gave them, while the pencil scurried illegibly across the pages, a brief description of the modern fertilizing process. Spoke first, of course, of its surgical introduction. The operation undergone voluntarily for the good of society, not to mention the fact that it carries a bonus accounting to 6 months' salary, continued with some account of the technique for preserving the excised ovary alive and actively developing, passed on to a consideration of optimum temperature, salinity, viscosity. Referred to the liquor in which the detached and ripened eggs were kept, and, leading his charges to the work tables, accidentally showed them how this liquor was drawn off from the test tubes, how it was let out drop by drop onto the specially warmed slides of the microscopes, how the eggs which it contained were inspected for abnormalities, counted, and transformed to a porous receptacle, how, and he now took them to watch the operation, this receptacle was immersed in a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermazoa at a minimum concentration of 100,000 per cubic centimetre, he insisted, and how, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the liquor and its contents re-examined. How, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and if necessary yet again, how the fertilized ova went back to the incubators, where the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while the gammas, deltas, and epsilons were brought out again after only 36 hours to undergo Bokanovsky's process. Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult normality. But a Bokanovsky egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide, from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow, where only one grew before. Progress. Essentially, the DHC concluded, Bokanovsification consists of a series of arrest development. We check the normal growth, and paradoxically enough, the egg responds by budding. Responds by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed. On a very slowly moving band, a rack full of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rack full was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the test tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard X-rays, about as much as an egg could stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into 2. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to the incubators, where the buds began to develop. Then, after 2 days, was suddenly chilled, and checked. 2, 4, 8, the buds in their turn budded, and, having budded, were dosed almost to death with alcohol, consequently burgeoned again. And having budded bud out of bud, were, thereafter, further arrest being generally fatal, left to develop in peace, by which time the original egg was in a fair way to becoming anything from 80 to 96 embryos, a prodigious improvement, you will agree, on nature. Identical twins, but not in piddling 2s and 3s, in the old viviparous days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide, actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores, the director repeated, and flung out his arms, as though he was distributing largesse. Scores. But one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. My good boy, the director wheeled sharply round to him. Can't you see? Can't you see? He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Major instruments of social stability. Standard men in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Boskanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. You really know where you are. For the first time in history, he quoted the planetary motto, community, identity, and stability. Grand words. If we could Boskonov identify, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniformed epsilons, millions of identical twins, the principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head, we can't Boskanovskify indefinitely. 96 seemed to be the limit, 72 a good average. From the same ovary and with gametes of the same male to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible, that was the best. Sadly, second best that they could do, and even that was difficult. For in nature, it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity, but our business is to stabilize the population at this moment, here and now. Dribbling out twins over a quarter of a century, what will be useful of that? Obviously, no use at all, but Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 150 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and Bernoskify, in other words, multiply by 72 and you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield us over 15,000 adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young woman who happened to be passing at the moment. Mr. Foster, he called. The ruddy young man approached. Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster? 16,012 in this centre, Mr. Foster replied, without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, had a vivacious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012 in 189 batches of identicals, but of course they've done much better, he rattled on. In some of the tropical centres, Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mombosa has actually touched the 17,000 mark, but then they have unfair advantages. You should see the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary. It's quite astonishing. When you're used to working with European material. Still, he added, with a laughing, but the light of combat was in his eye, and the lifting of his chin was challenging. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful Delta Minus ovary at this moment. Only just 18 months to go. Over 12,700 children already. Either decanted or an embryo. And still going strong. We'll beat them yet. That's the spirit I like, cried the director, and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. Come along with us, and give these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge. Mr. Foster smiled modestly. With pleasure. They went. In the bottling room all was harmonious bustling and ordered activity. Flaps of fresh So's peritonium, ready cut to the proper size, came shooting up in little lifts from the organ store in the sub-basement. Whiz and then click. The lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner had only to reach out a hand, take the flap, insert, smooth down, and, before the lined bottle had had time to travel out of reach along the endless band, whiz, click, another flap of peritonium had shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle. The next of that slow interminimal procession on the band. Next to the liners stood the matriculators. The procession advanced one by one. The eggs were transferred from their test tubes to the larger containers. Deftly, the peritoneal lining was slit. The morula dropped into place. The saline solution poured in, and already the bottle had passed. And it was the turn of the labellers. hereditary date of fertilization, membership of Boskanovsky's group details were transferred from test tube to bottle. No longer anonymous, but named, identified. The procession marched slowly on through an opening in the wall, slowly on into the social predestination room. 88 cubic meters of card index, said Mr. Foxer with relish as they entered. Containing all the relevant information, added the director. Brought up to date every morning, and coordinated every afternoon, on the basis of which they make their calculations. So many individuals of such and such quality, said Mr. Foster, distributed in such and such quantities, the optimum decanting rate at any given moment. Unforeseen wastages promptly made good. Promptly, repeated Mr. Foster. If you knew the amount of overtime I had to put in that last Japanese earthquake. He laughed good-humorously and shook his head. The predestinators send in their figures to the fertilizers, who give them the embryos they ask for, and the bottles come in here to be predestined in detail, after which they are sent down to the embryo store, where we now proceed ourselves. And opening a door, Mr. Foster led the way down a staircase into the basement. The temperature was still tropical. They descended into a thickening twilight. 2 doors and a passage with a double turn ensured the cellar against any possible infiltration of the day. Embryos are like photograph film, said Mr. Foster waggishly as he pushed open the second door. They can only stand red light. And in effect, the sultry darkness into which the students now followed him was visible and crimson, like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer afternoon. The bulging flanks of row on receding row and tier above tier of bottles glinted with innumerable rubies, and among the rubies moved the dim, red spectres of men and women with purple eyes and all the symptoms of lupus. The human and rattle of machinery faintly stirred the air. "Give them a few figures, Mr. Foster," said the director, who was tired of talking. Mr. Foster was only too happy to give them a few figures. 220 meters long, 200 wide, 10 high. He pointed upwards. Like chickens drinking, the students lifted their eyes towards the distant ceiling. 3 tiers of racks, ground floor level, first gallery, second gallery. The spidery steel work of gallery above gallery faded away in all directions into the dark. Near them, 3 red ghosts were busily unloading demijohns on the moving staircase. The escalator from the social predestination room. Each bottle could be placed on one of 15 racks. Each rack, though you couldn't see it, was a conveyor travelling at the rate of 33 1/3 centimeters an hour. 267 days at 8 meters a day, 2,136 meters in all. 1 circuit of the cellar at ground level, 1 on the first day, half on the second, and 1 the 267th morning. Daylight in the decanting room. Independent existence, so called. But in the interval, Mr. Foster concluded, we've managed to do a lot to them. Oh, it's a great deal. His laugh was knowing and triumphant. That's the spirit I like, said the director once more. Let's walk around. You tell them everything, Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster duly told them of the growing embryo on its bed of peritoneum, made them taste the rich blood surrogate on which it fed, explained why it had to be stimulated with placentin and thyrosin, told them of the corpus luteum extract, showed them the jets through which, at every 12th meter from 0 to 2040, it was automatically injected, spoke of those gradually increasing doses of pituitary administered during the final 96 meters of their course, described the artificial maternal circulation installed in every bottle at meter 112, showed them the reservoir of blood surrogate, the centrifugal pump that kept the liquid moving over the placenta and drove it through the synthetic lung and waste product filter, referred to the embryo's troublesome tendency to anemia, to massive doses of hog's stomach extract and fetal fowl's liver, with which, in consequence, it had to be supplied, showed them the simple mechanism by means of which, during the last 2 meters out of every 8, all the embryos were simultaneously shaken into familiarity with movement, hinted at the gravity of the so-called trauma of decanting, and enumerated the precautions taken to minimize, by suitable training of the bottled embryo, that dangerous shock, told them of the test for sex carried out in the neighborhood of meter 200, explained the system of labeling a T for the males and a circle for the females, and for those who were destined to become free martins, a question mark, black on a white ground. For of course, said Mr. Foster, in the vast majority of cases, fertility is merely a nuisance. 1 fertile ovary in 1200, that would really be quite sufficient for our purposes. But we want to have a good choice, and of course one must always have an enormous margin of safety. So we allow as many as 30% of the female embryos to develop normally. The others get a dose of male sex hormone every 24 meters for the rest of the course. Result, they decanted as Freemasons structurally quite normal, except, he had to admit, that they have the slightest tendency to grow beards, but sterile, guaranteed sterile, which brings us, at last, continued Mr. Foster, out of the realm of mere slavish imitation of nature into the much more industry world of human invention. He rubbed his hands, for of course they didn't content themselves with merely hatching out embryos. Any cow could do that. We also predestine and condition. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons, as future sewage workers or future. He was going to say future world controllers, but corrected himself, and said future directors of hatcheries instead. The DHC acknowledged the compliment with a smile. They were passing meter 320 on rack 11. A young beta-minus mechanic was busy with screwdriver and spanner on the blood surrogate pump of a passing bottle. The hum of the electric motor deepened by fractions of a tone as he turned the nuts. Down, down, a final twist, a glance at the revolution counter, and he was done. He moved 2 paces down the line and began the same process on the next bump. Reducing the number of revolutions per minute, Mr. Foster explains. The surrogate goes round slower, therefore passes through the lung at longer intervals, keeping the embryos less oxygen. Nothing like oxygen shortage for keeping an embryo below par. Again, he rubbed his hands. But why do you want to keep the embryo below par? Asked an ingenious student. Ass, said the director, breaking a long silence. Hasn't it occurred to you that an epsilon embryo must have an epsilon environment as well as an epsilon hereditary? It evidently hadn't occurred to him. He was covered with confusion. The lower the caste, said Mr. Foster, the shorter the oxygen. The first organ affected was the brain, after that the skeleton. At 70% of normal oxygen, you go to dwarfs. At less than 70, eyeless monsters, who are not useful at all, concluded Mr. Foster. Whereas, his voice became confident and eager, if they could discover a technique for shortening the period of maturation, what a triumph, what a benefaction to society. Consider the horse. They considered it. Mature at 6, the elephant at 10, while at 13, a man is not sexually mature, and is only fully grown at 20, hence, of course, that fruit of delayed development, the human intelligence. But in epsilons, said Mr. Foster very justly. We don't need human intelligence. Didn't need and didn't get it. Though the Epsilon mind was mature at 10, the Epsilon body was not fit to work till 18. Long years of superfluous and wasted immaturity. If the physical development could be speeded up till it was as quick as, say, a cow, what an enormous saving to the community. Enormous, murmured the students. Mr. Foster's enthusiasm was infectious. He became rather technical, spoke of the abnormal endocrine coordination which made men grow so slowly, postulated a germinal mutation to account for it. Could the effects of this germinal mutation be undone? Could the individual epsilon embryo be made revert by a suitable technique to the normality of dogs and cows? That was the problem, and it was all but solved. Pilkington at Mombasa had produced individuals who were sexually mature at 4 and fully grown at 6.5. A scientific triumph, but socially useless. 6-year-old men and women were too stupid to do even epsilon work, and the process was an all-or-nothing one. Either you failed to modify it all, or else you modified the whole way. They were still trying to find the ideal compromise between adults of 20 and adults of 6. So far, without success. Mr. Foster sighed and shook his head. Their wanderings through the crimson twilight had brought them to the neighbourhood of meter 170 on Rack 9. From this point onwards, Rack 9 was enclosed, and the bottle performed the remainder of the journey in a kind of tunnel, interrupted here and there by openings 2 or 3 meters wide. Heat conditioning, said Mr. Foster. Hot tunnels alternated with cool tunnels. Coolness was welded to discomfort in the form of hard X-rays. By the time they were decanted, the embryos had a horror of cold. They were predestined to emigrate to the tropics, to be minor anacatate sill spiders and steel workers. Later on, their minds would be made to endorse the judgment of their bodies. We condition them to thrive on heat, concluded Mr. Foster. Our colleagues upstairs will teach them to love it. And that, put in the director sententiously, that is the secret of happiness and virtue liking, what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. In a gap between 2 tunnels, a nurse was delicately probing with a long, fine syringe into the gelatinous contents of a passing bottle. The students and their guides stood watching her for a few moments in silence. "Well, Lenina," said Mr. Foster, when at the last she withdrew the syringe and straightened herself up. The girl turned with a start. One could see that, for all the lupus and the purple eyes, she was uncommonly pretty. "Henry!" Her smile flashed redly at him with a row of coral teeth. "Charming, charming," murmured the director, and, giving her 2 or 3 little pats, received in exchange a rather deferential smile for himself. "What are you giving them?" asked Mr. Foster, making his tone very professional. "Oh, the usual typhoid and sleep sickness. Tropical workers start being inoculated at meter 150, Mr. Foster explained to the students. The embryos still have gills. We immunize the fish against the future man's diseases." Then, turning back to Lenina, 10 to 5 on the roof this afternoon, he said, as usual. "Charming," said the doctor once more, and with a final pat moved away after the others. On Rack 10, rows of next generation's chemical workers were being trained in the toleration of lead, caustic soda, tar, and chlorine. The first of a batch of 250 embryonic rocket plane engineers was just past the 1100 meter on Rack 3. A special mechanism kept their containers in constant rotation. To improve their sense of balance, Mr. Foster explained. Doing repairs on the outside of a rocket in mid-air is a ticklish job. We slacken off the circulation when they're right way up, so that they're half-starved, and double the flow of surrogate when they're upside down. They learn to associate topsy-turvydom with well-being. In fact, they are only truly happy when they're standing on their heads. And now, Mr. Foster went on, I'd like to show you some very interesting conditioner for Alpha Plus intellectuals. We have a big batch of them on Rack 5, first gallery level. He called 2 boys who had started to go down to the ground floor. They're round about meter 900, he explained. You can't really do anything useful intellectual conditioning till the fetuses have lost their tails. Follow me. But the director had looked at his watch. 10 to 3. He said, No time for the intellectual embryos, I'm afraid. We must go up to the nurseries before the children have finished their afternoon sleep. Mr. Foster was disappointed. At least one glance at the canting room, he pleaded. Very well then, the director smiled indulgently. Just one glance. And that, my dear friends, is the end of the extremely exciting Book 1. What a strange world. And I hope you'll continue to see this world with me and just slow down and relax and stay happy and take a break and good night.